like for people who aren't here who are interested? Cool. Let me just make this full screen.
We can always turn the recording off for the discussion section too, if that's a preference.
Yeah. Now, do you have the full screen presentation, or do you have the weird next slide, no notes thing?
Full screen, all good.
Oh, great.
Excuse me, Catherine.
Yes.
Is it possible to have your slide?
Yeah, we can send them around later as well.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So what I've planned for is about a 25 to 30 minute presentation, followed by discussion. That's a bit long, quite frankly, but the problem I've got here is that critical realism is a philosophy of science, and it is not straightforward. There are some key things about the philosophy that I need to explain before I then talk about, well, what does it mean in terms of research, and then give you some examples from my own work. So I'm trying to sort of not be too complicated, but also not be too superficial. And hopefully I've found the right balance. There are 4 things that I'll do in the presentation. The first thing is just give you some basics of critical realism. Secondly, talk about implications that I see for applied research or for research generally, 4 different areas. I think there are more. This is just some that I'd like to highlight. I'll then talk about emancipatory social science. So how I think critical realism actually facilitates and encourages social science for transformation and progressive social change. And then I'll give a couple of examples from recent research work that I've done, where I try and give you some ideas about how critical realism has transformed what I've done, and therefore what my findings have been and what the implications of that research are for policy and practice. So the first thing is, it's worth saying that I think, from my perspective, I think my social research is motivated by social justice and by reversing inequality. There's 2 things it needs to do, both of which are challenges. It needs to understand the nature of wicked social problems, how they manifest, when, for whom, in what contexts. And I would argue we need to move from a description of events that happen to actually theorising causal explanations in a way that suggests practical steps or positive interventions. And I think these are both things that critical realism has enabled me to do better. Critical realism is a philosophy of science, as I said, so it's a meta-theoretical framework. It provides a number of philosophical concepts which I then, through translation into a methodology, use as analytical tools. And my experience has been that critical realism's conceptual frameworks have provided really interesting prompts to my thinking, which have both deepened and extended my critical and analytical thinking in response to data and in response to literature, and strengthened my capacity for particularly causal explanation. This is I guess, where the focus of this talk is. I think mostly when we're doing applied work, particularly evaluation work, we really are thinking about causality. So thinking about explanation, perhaps even more so than understanding, although both have a place. There are 4 pillars of critical realism that I'll speak to today. This is not exhaustive, but I hopefully give you a sense of the core things that define what makes critical realist thinking what it is. The first thing is, in terms of ontology, it's a realist ontology. So what that means is that the nature of things is real, it's stratified and emergent, which I'll explain in a minute. Much of reality exists and operates independently of our awareness and knowledge of it. So what that means is that what we see is a subset of all the things that actually happen, and the structures, their powers, the causal mechanisms that make those things happen are at a level that we can't see them directly. So the level of the real is where all of the stuff that makes things happen is, but we can't see it directly. What we see is a subset of the things that happen as a consequence of these powers. We don't see everything. That's the first thing. So we only see some of what there is, and all of that, all the causality that makes things happen exists whether we see it or not, and regardless of our knowledge of it, it's completely independent. The second thing is that we, as in the social world, are operating in open systems, which means that mechanisms interact, they're context dependent, their interactions are complex and contingent. Thirdly, we live in a social world that is stratified, and what I mean by that is that there are different hierarchical places within social reality that are connected to each other. So things happen in the biological world, for example. They happen in the psychological level. They happen to us as individuals and individual agency at the individual level. And then there are also social structures that can be the sort of structures that we think of in terms of maybe a bureaucracy or cultural structures, or even above that, sort of much higher level normative structures. And so this is what we mean by stratification, that a social problem is being generated potentially by a number of those different levels that interact across the levels. And the concept of emergence is that if you have things interacting at a lower level, what they produce at the next level up is a new entity with its own nature, its own powers that are irreducible to just adding together what those entities are at the lower level. I hope that makes sense. Emergence is one of those things that it either clicks or sometimes it doesn't and needs more talking about, but that's the starting point. So what does this mean? It means that the essential features of the world that we want to understand actually need to be theoretically inferred because we can't see them. So we need to be theorising what is their nature, how are they related to each other, and how are they generated. Which leads to point 2, epistemic relativism. What this means is that the knowledge we create, this theoretical knowledge, is always going to be historically, culturally, and socially situated. It's fallible. We build it up over time. We accumulate our knowledge, and we use evidence and arguments that are empirically informed to support and generate and critique our theories so that our knowledge about the world develops. The third thing is judgmental rationality, and this is again connected. If we have different theorising of why things are the way they are over time, for example, how do we decide which is a better explanation? And I think this speaks to what we do all the time anyway with our own work and when we evaluate other people's work. We're automatically thinking about things like, what is the quality of the argument? How well does the argument link to the empirical information that's been presented? We think about relatively how strong are the theories in explaining what we see? How well do they explain away or deal with counterfactuals? And we are going to get to the reality of things in different ways depending on the lenses that we bring to the problem. I would also argue that in my experience, critical realism as a meta-theoretical foundation produces better explanations than what I previously was able to do without it. So the fundamental underlying logic of research then becomes piecemeal inquiry and evaluation of our knowledge, and that we're building empirical support for our theories, but some statements turn out to be inconsistent with the way that we then discover the world is, or the way we believe the world to be. And the fourth pillar is called in critical realism cautious ethical naturalism. I think this is something that is actually much harder to immediately accept, perhaps, because the idea is that our values and our ethics, what good looks like, is not something that we culturally generate. Actually, there are realities of what a good life is, what flourishing looks like, what good society looks like, what it means to be emancipated, and that through our inquiries about the nature of the real world, we also learn what those are. So what it means is that unlike with positivism, for example, or the sort of the things that we learnt from Hume and others, that there is a fact-value distinction, that we need to be objective, that facts are separate to values and values are separate to facts. Instead, critical realism sees that, in fact, our values are laden by facts and our facts are value-laden. So there is an interchange between facts and values. We develop descriptions which are of the things that we see, which are value laden, but also we learn about our values through finding out more about the nature of the world and what we evaluate to be better outcomes. The implication of this is that values are then necessarily open to empirical investigation and critique. So how people value things, their ultimate concerns, the reasons why they act, the things that drive them as agents, all of these become really important parts of how we do our research in terms of what we actually study. Values need to be investigated as causals, as having causal mechanisms in themselves. And it also, the other implication is that social science is then given permission to actually really try and tell us something about what the good life is. So it is a value-orientated endeavour. It is not something where we need to be objective. Our values and the values that we are wanting to see progressed are intrinsically part of the work that we do, and then it becomes all about how we explain that and how we make that explicit and how we also analyse our responses to things as researchers as much as how people in society are responding to the social world themselves. So there's some fundamental things. What does that mean in terms of the research? Firstly, that causality is not linear, which I think we all kind of know instinctively anyway, just looking around us. The whole idea that if I do X, then Y will happen is so, to my mind, fundamentally flawed, because we live in a conjunctive and complex reality. Things, mechanisms interact with each other. There are some causal conditions which are necessary to produce an outcome. There are others which are sufficient, and there might be multiple different mechanisms or different sets of conditions that are sufficient to produce an outcome. And our object of study is a product of mechanisms and emergent structures from all of those relevant levels of reality. So it becomes more difficult to produce causal explanations if you allow for all this, because context becomes really important, and how you think about conjunctive interactions becomes really important. Leading from that, and then data is a form of evidence at the empirical level, observable level of social reality, but we need to move from description to explanation through theorising if we're going to make claims about how things happen, causal explanations. There are three main ways that this can happen. First of all, by abstracting what are the structures, what are the features of the phenomenon, its internal relations and its relations externally to other objects, what makes it what it is and not something else. So what's the nature of the structures through abstraction. Abduction is a process of redescribing what we see, but in theoretical language. So moving from the sort of the detail of many different examples to thinking more generalizably or theoretically about what it is that we are seeing. And then the third component of moving from description to causal explanation, the next fundamental one is a form of inference called retroduction, which is asking questions about what makes this phenomenon actually possible. So what things would need to exist or not exist for the thing that we've observed to happen. And Bhaskar says, Roy Bhaskar is one of the foundation critical realists in this tradition that I'm speaking about. And he talks about it as being imagining a model of a mechanism that, if it were real, would account for the phenomenon in question. So very much a theoretical undertaking. Which leads to the next point, that critical realism implies a use of social theory. Social theory is necessary to help explain the interactions that we see and to generate accounts of mechanisms and contexts. Social theory enables those processes of abstraction, abduction, and retroduction I mentioned before. Critical realism can also work on social theory as a meta theory to change ontologically and epistemologically, maybe how some of those theories are working. And I would argue potentially in ways that then create greater depth and greater explanatory power. So 2 examples from my work is using a psychological theory of mechanisms of trauma in times of resource crisis, which is Conservation of Resources by Hopful. When you think about that in terms of structure and agency, as that is conceived in critical realism, it opens up that conservation of resources theory in a way that I think makes it more powerful to describe the mechanisms that we see operating in the social world in terms of homelessness. And the second is when there's a lot of different forms of intersectionality, but one of the criticisms often is its lack of depth or real depths in terms of stratification. And this is another area in which some of my research has brought critical realism into an existing social theory in order to challenge it, critique it, and develop it so that I think it becomes a more powerful way of explaining theoretically what's being seen. Theory also becomes a necessary output of empirical inquiry because you need the theory to explain what it is that you're seeing, whether it's at a very low mid-range or something that's more disciplinary or something that's a much larger theory. You're always going to be generating theory to explain what it is that you're seeing. If you want to say anything about causation, for example. The third implication is that critical realism offers some amazing frameworks for thinking about the interaction of structure and agency. It's probably not news to anybody that trying to understand the role of, or the primacy of whether it's structure or whether it's agency that has the most impact on the other and how they interact with each other has been something that's been discussed in sociological theory over the last 200 years. And for me, critical realism answers a lot of those questions because it provides a really coherent way of thinking about how structure and agency interact over time. And there are a number of different models within Bhaskar's writing and also Margaret Archer's writing that are theorising that relationship in different ways within a critical realist philosophical landscape, but that provide very interesting and practical ways of doing analysis in particular context, in particular research contexts. And they've become really important to me when I'm thinking about how structures are mediated by human agency, for example, and how human agency works to establish structures. So all those constraining and enabling mechanisms that structures have, but also the way that they are then reproduced and changed through human agency. And it's all just different ways of asking questions of the data for me, I think, that all of these frameworks are providing more nuanced and complex but helpful frameworks that then suggest the kinds of questions that I can ask of data to develop theories from and develop explanations from that would be helpful. The final area that I want to talk about in terms of implications is in terms of interdisciplinary inquiry. So if we've talked before about stratification and that there can be lots of different levels within social reality that are implicated in a particular outcome, such as homelessness, then it sort of makes sense that different academic disciplines, for example, that are working particularly at different levels of those strata, are going to shine a different light on the problem. And their different methodological and philosophical lenses are going to give us different perspectives on the problem. And one of the things that critical realism has offered me is a framework for how I can both read and assess the literature across multiple disciplines that are dealing with different levels of that stratified reality, but also a framework for integrating them and synthesizing them into a larger causal explanation. So, for example, when thinking about homelessness, it's easy to develop an explanation which sees mechanisms within many different levels of social reality, from that sort of cultural and normative and other structures through to individual experiences and people's agency and the psychological processes through which they mediate structure and agency, for example, or that impact on their capacity to act as agents. I actually, in this piece of work, started talking about a transdisciplinary explanation. So an explanation that has emerged from the work of different disciplines. So it moves, using the idea of emergence, that it's beyond just adding together what the different disciplines already say, but by bringing them together in this critical realist framework, actually turning them into something new that is transdisciplinary and speaks in a different way to the problem that's wanting to be understood. So where does that leave us in terms of a practice of emancipatory social science? I think there are three fundamental questions which resonate through all my work. What is the problem? What is its nature? How do we understand the problem? What generates the problem, for whom, why, and in what contexts? And what can be done to alleviate the problem? And there's a number of principles within critical realism and where people talk about what it means to do emancipatory social science for progressive change. And I'll just talk about some of those issues, some of those things that come up. The first is that critical realist research is by necessity, by definition, built on normative foundations. So it really is about understanding human flourishing, understanding what makes a good life, what makes a good society, how do we build better social worlds in which to live. It involves diagnosis and critique, which in critical realism is called explanatory critique. And this is so understanding how the issue is impacting and its normative foundations. Thirdly, envisaging alternatives. Critical realism has a beautiful, I guess, it's almost like a metaphor, called concrete utopianism, or reaching for concrete utopias. And what I like about this is, for many of us, utopias suggest ideals that are maybe unreachable, that are things that, you know, if everything was perfect, this is what the world would be like according to our own version of what perfect looks like. The idea of saying concrete utopias is, what is it we can actually achieve given the resources that we have? And when we envisage alternatives, we're thinking in terms of desirability, but also viability and achievability. And this is where we start to have impacts on social policy, on politics, where we think about whose values and whose version of the good life, obviously, and how we're developing our ethical and normative ideas about what better looks like, what progressive looks like, what the best outcomes look like, which are really relevant, obviously, for evaluation in particular. And then finally, we need to have a theory of transformation if we're working towards a concrete utopia. And a theory of transformation is a causal theory, but it's a causal theory that's looking forward rather than looking backwards to how have things developed the way they have. So they're fundamentally connected to the theories of causation that we are developing if we're doing explanatory causal research. And so in this case, it's what, you know, thinking about the obstacles, the possibilities, trajectories of perhaps unintended social change, our strategies, what interventions, where, when, for whom, in what context. And I think of it as being really a reflection of causal explanatory theory, because what we learn in explaining, we are then using to develop the real possibilities that we are then working towards. Another quote by Bhaskar, which I think also illustrates just how sometimes his writing is really difficult. But anyway, the theory of explanatory critique thus opens up the possibility that social science, and more generally science, may be able to justify social policies rationally and indeed, in the last instance, determine and even discover true and well-grounded values, in particular by determining beliefs that prove to be incompatible with their own true explanation. And I think what he's getting to with this is that by researching what the social world is like, we discover where the beliefs that people hold are actually incompatible with the nature of the thing as we are finding it out to be. And that is the point at which we can start to critique and to argue against and to look for change. And so our research becomes about rationality, but at the same time about values and about determining what better looks like. So 2 short examples. Up till now, for the last 5 years or so, my research has been on homelessness and the causes of homelessness for different populations within Australia. The first project was on family homelessness, and sorry, MA stands for Mission Australia. I should have gone back and filled that in. But the research project that I was originally on, one of the programs of Mission Australia that was working with families living in socioeconomic disadvantaged contexts, what they wanted to know was, how can we predict which of these families is going to end up homeless so that we can get in early and prevent that, which is a very reasonable question, because all the families they were working with were, had a lot of different challenges that they were trying to meet. The assumption behind the way the question was being answered on that research project was that we know lots about what the risk factors are for families to become homeless. So, if one of the parents was in care as a child, if someone has a mental illness, if someone has low education, all of these things that are associated with a greater representation in homelessness populations, what we need to do is just weight them against each other for which is more risky and which is less risky, and then add everything up and give people a score. And if people have a score of X out of 100 compared to X plus 3 out of 100, then the second person has more risk of homelessness. Therefore, we put more services in their direction. Fundamentally, that didn't work for me. It didn't make sense. And through a critical realist perspective, it absolutely doesn't make sense. When I was off that project, I then worked through my PhD on a different explanatory theory, and it became very much focused on resources. And the fundamental argument then became, if as a family you are challenged by some crisis in your life or some increased insecurity to your housing, but you do not have the resources to meet that challenge, then you're likely to become homeless. And by resources, it could be socioeconomic resources, it could be human capital such as education and work history, it could be social capital, so the degree to which you're able to draw down on the resources from your network to meet the challenges you're facing. It could be your psychological resources, so the degree to which you're traumatized, you're living with anxiety or other mental illness that changes your capacity to manage and cognitively deal with problems. It could be a range of different kinds of resources, but fundamentally, if you don't have the resources to meet the challenge to your housing, particularly in the context of Australia's housing market and the way the welfare system works, then you're likely to become homeless. So that's the mechanistic causal argument that I came up with, or the explanation I came up with, which then means you have a very different answer to the question of what kind of predictive early intervention tool would I recommend. It would then more likely look like an audit of people's resources, an audit or an investigation into or identification of what the current status of their housing is in terms of their security of tenancy, or the proportion of their regular income that goes to paying their rent, for example, or how appropriate that housing is for the needs of the family. And by looking at those kinds of factors, so the likelihood of housing insecurity becoming a problem, as well as the resources the family has at their disposal, what you'd be then doing is targeting families where their potential for crisis is higher and their recourse through their own resources to meet that crisis is lower. And that would be a different way of assessing the potential vulnerability of those families to homelessness. That is not just about, you know, what labels you can give them according to prior life experience. It's quite a different, fundamentally different way of looking at it. The second project was about older single women who are experiencing homelessness for the first time. This has increasingly in Australia over the last 30 years become an issue. And so once again, this was a project to try and develop an explanation of why should this be the case in this particular time that women over the age of 55 are increasingly experiencing first-time homelessness as single women. And the explanations were heavily informed by theory, both intersectionality between age and gender, and also social reproduction theory, which comes from Marxism but has been used outside of that tradition as well. And in both cases, critical realism enabled an increased depth, reality, and attention to social stratification than the original theories actually provided for. And so by incorporating a critical realist framework for thinking about both depth, reality, and stratification into the use of those two social theories, it enabled those theories, I think, to do more work to explain what we were seeing from the literature and from data. It put our focus much more on explaining, our theoretical explanation became much more focused on structures, almost through that mechanism. So social and cultural structures, rather than what was necessarily happening to individual women. Certainly, individual women's experiences were framed by those structures in which they had been living, but fundamentally, the causal mechanisms that are increasing homelessness for this cohort of women are happening at the level of social and cultural structures, which then means the nature of the interventions changes. It doesn't, I mean, obviously there are interventions to be done to assist women to get back into housing and to assist women not to lose their housing. But fundamentally, to reverse that trend, there needs to be changes structurally. And so the nature of the interventions then become about how our superannuation is structured, how childcare is available, whether it's appropriate, whether it's affordable, and whether it's going to serve the needs of parents, both men and women, appropriately. Cultural change around who uses parental leave and what happens if you do use your parental leave in the work context. Things to do with workforce participation, but also who pays for the social reproduction that is required by society. So who will do the caring, and whether women get paid or compensated for that. So these big structural factors then are put in the spotlight by thinking in terms of a stratified reality rather than just at the level of the individual. A lot of the talk about why older women become homeless is very much this is not exclusively, there's a lot of people talking about structure as well, but many of the explanations are about the experience and the characteristics of individual women. But that doesn't really explain why women are in that situation and then at higher risk of homelessness. So I think bringing in some of those elements of critical realism has enabled me to take things further than they already were being described. I'll leave it there. I'll leave the slide up with the references for a second, but also I'll send around the slides later. And I would welcome questions. Actually, I will just end the slideshow because then I can see people. That would be better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. Shall I stop recording now so we can put it
Sure.
online?
Yep, sure.